Hi, I'm Heather Wood. I'm going to be reading the first chapter of my third novel, Until the Light Breaks Through, which was published in 2022. For ye were sometimes darkness, but now are ye light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. Ephesians 5:8. Chapter 1. November 12, 1870. Jack Young could count on one hand the number of things he'd done right in his life, and from the looks of things now, this was not one of them. "Help me, Uncle Jack." Jack backed up to the maple tree and lifted his arms. "If you promise not to tell your mama I allowed you to climb trees. Here, get onto my shoulders." "I promise." Clara's scuffed shoes and dirt-streaked stockings appeared on either side of his head, and her weight settled onto him. "You're on tight?" Jack's head pulled backwards as she grasped his black curls in her fist. "Mm-hmm." Jack stepped away from the tree with his charge and turned around to supervise Abigail and Louisa scrambling down the trunk. "Are you ready to head home? Your papa and mama should be back soon." Jack surveyed the girls, rosy-cheeked from the cold afternoon of scampering through the woods, and could already feel searing heat from the look he'd soon get from his older brother. "Oh, not yet, please." Jack widened his eyes at Louisa's tangled locks. "I have to get you all cleaned up before your mother sees you, or she'll skin me. And I don't know how you're not starving. I could eat a bison." He lifted his leg and pawed the ground like one before charging forward in the direction of the path. Clara squealed, throwing her arms around his head and covering his eyes. Jack stopped short with a breathless laugh. "I can't see you, monkey." Tightening his grasp on her middle, he swung her to the ground. Abigail ran past, her brown curls windblown and coat unbuttoned. "I want the letters from Aunt Kelly." "I want Samuel," Clara shouted, dashing after her. "Come on, Peanut." Jack extended his hand to Louisa. Louisa gave a dramatic sigh. "You're always hungry." Jack grinned when she willingly took his hand anyway and walked with him. By the time they reached the clearing, Abigail and Clara were sitting on the edge of the cabin's porch, listening to the rumble of Jed's approaching wagon. "You're going to get it, Uncle Jack." Louisa giggled at the unkempt state of her sisters. Jack gritted his teeth theatrically for the sake of more giggles as the wagon stopped beside him. "Good heavens!" Mary gasped, clutching the baby to her chest. Jack reached her side before Jed did, and gently held her elbow as she descended from her seat to assess the children. "You make quite the nursery maid." Jed wrapped his good arm around a burlap sack in the back of the wagon and heaved it into Jack's chest. "I'm glad we didn't leave Samuel with you." "We couldn't help it, Mama." Abigail accepted a can of baking powder from Jed and joined the children traipsing up the stairs after Mary. "We asked Uncle Jack if we could sit home and embroider this afternoon, but he insisted that if we didn't climb trees, we couldn't have supper." "Oh, come on now," Jack shouted, lowering his sack to the ground. Mary's laugh echoed through the cabin. "I'm sure you did, darling," she called, loud enough for Jack to hear. "I have your mail." Jed reached into his vest pocket when they were alone and leafed through the envelopes, handing 3 over. He arched an eyebrow as Jack examined the top postmark. North Carolina. Jack's blood ran cold. He felt Jed's steady eyes studying him and attempted to calm his racing heart. "Thanks." He slipped the envelopes into his pocket, inwardly cursing his shaking hands. "You're the one who asked for answers, and now you have them." Inhaling, he turned away from Jed and lifted the sack again. Jed grunted behind him, and Jack ignored it. It hadn't really been his idea to investigate the consequences of his past mistakes anyway. After he graduated seminary, God made it clear that he had business to attend to before beginning ministry. Although part of it was coming to Wisconsin to work on his relationship with Jed, the likely contents of this envelope were not something he was ready to talk about. Jack worked quickly, and once the wagon was unloaded, Jed left to unhitch his team. "I'm heading down to camp." The imposing sense of dread eating at his stomach chased away his earlier playfulness, but he managed weak smiles for Jed's stepdaughters and tousled their heads. By the time he reached the road down to Schmidt's lodge, Jed had caught up to him. "Are you having supper with us?" Jed asked. "Sure. I just want some quiet to read my mail while you do chores, and then I'll come back up with you." "Is everything okay?" The question was unusual coming from his taciturn brother, and Jack knew he'd failed miserably at hiding his anxiety. He attempted a nonchalant shrug. "You saw the envelope." "I did, but this is the first time you've had mail from her. I don't know what's going on." Jack pulled his coat tighter, crossing his arms over the letters against his chest. "I'll know after I read it. See you after a bit." The camp opened up before them, and Jack headed to Schmidt's lodge while Jed veered away toward the camp stables. On the lodge doorstep, Jack reached inside his coat for the letters, staring again at his name on the top envelope. What would happen if he didn't open it? None of his sins had followed him before. They would never think to look at in a camp for loggers in rural Wisconsin, let alone at the church in Kentucky, where he was heading to begin ministry in a couple of months. Jack tugged at the curls on the back of his neck and let out a shaky breath. The answer was too clear to ignore. He bore enough scars from years spent living in rebellion against God. He could never knowingly disobey again. There was no other option but to continue to follow this path wherever it led. With a racing heart, Jack pulled open the door and headed to his bunk. Jed gave the water pump one last yank, filling the pail almost to the brim before pushing the handle closed to stop the stream. He bent to reach for the pail handle, but the sound of an otherworldly wail stopped him halfway to the ground. He jerked upright, his eyes tracking around the camp for the source of the noise. What in tarnation could produce a howl like that? It wasn't quite a scream, and not really a cry, but it made the back of his neck prickle. A commotion at the door of the lodge captured his attention, and he turned to see Daniel Brighton striding toward him with one of Mary's nephews at his heels. "It's Jack," Daniel called before he reached the stable. Jed stared at his best friend as if he hadn't heard correctly. "That's Jack?" The infernal noise continued, and Jed's heart stopped. It didn't sound like someone who was hurt. It sounded devastating. Jed turned his eyes questioningly to Michael, and the 12-year-old jerked his thumb toward the lodge. He was just on his bunk reading his mail when all of a sudden he jumped down and ran for the door, looking like he was going to throw up. He didn't start hollering until he was in the woods. "His mail?" Jed repeated through a dry mouth. He strode toward the lodge, the others tripping after him. He hadn't opened his own mail yet. Had something happened to their older siblings in Chicago? But wouldn't they have telegraphed if news was that bad? From Jack's bunk, Jed lifted Justin's and Kelly's sealed envelopes, and his eyes slid shut as he exhaled in relief. Something else fluttered to the floor, and Michael snatched it. Before he even handed it to Jed, Jed knew it was Elison's empty envelope. Jed was aware of the eyes watching him as he stood in the bunkhouse and tried to remember everything Jack said to him over the past 3 months. It had been August when Jack showed up begging for reconciliation, and Jed had endured many painfully honest conversations with him since then. Not once had Jed mentioned Elison or her husband, Pick. Sure, Pick was an old friend of Jack's from the 5th North Carolina, and Justin and Kelly had married Elison's siblings, but Pick and Elison returned to North Carolina years ago. Jed couldn't imagine news from their family making Jack howl like a dying bobcat. On the other hand, Jack had been a very lost, orphaned nobody for the 13 years he lived in North Carolina after their parents' deaths left him abandoned on the doorstep of an uncaring uncle. By the time his older siblings found him during the war, Jack had left a trail of destruction in that state. Jed stood helplessly staring at Jack's name in Elison's messy script. Chances were the news he'd just received wasn't about Elison. This was personal. It had to be information about Jack himself, and Jed didn't know the first thing about what to do for him. "Do you have any idea what's wrong?" Daniel asked. Jed slowly shook his head and then nodded. He didn't know the details, but he knew enough to have a general idea. "Do you think he would prefer to be left alone right now?" There was the rub. Jack was in every way the opposite of himself. If Jed had a problem, he just needed a piece of quiet and a long horseback ride to work it out. But Jack had never wanted to be alone as long as Jed had known him. He certainly wouldn't want to be alone in a moment of trauma. Those brought words out of Jack like vomit from a poisoned cow. "He needs Kelly," Jed said evenly without lifting his eyes. Kelly was the rock in the family. She had the best listening ear and always knew just what each of her brothers needed, even when they didn't know themselves. She'd also spent several years as Jack's close confidant and probably had a perfect understanding of him. This was a situation tailor-made for Kelly's skills. Emotions were miles off the map from Jed's, particularly loud, messy, complicated emotions. The problem was that Kelly was 200 miles away. "He needs you," Daniel said at his elbow. "I don't do this." Jed stopped himself before he said it aloud. What on earth could he do for Jack? Somehow he didn't think his usual, "well, figure it out" speech would be helpful today. Although Jed didn't fully believe the truth in Daniel's statement, he set Jack's unopened mail back on his bunk and headed toward the door with a license envelope in hand. He was Jack's only family present, so he had a duty to do. When Jed stepped back outside, the camp was quiet. From around the clearing, friends, lodge guests, and Mary's relatives watched him stalk resolutely into the trees. It didn't take long to track Jack, who had been about as stealthy as a charging buffalo. At the end of a freshly broken path, he came upon the prostrate body of his brother. Jed took off his old slouch hat and ran his fingers through his black curls, but came no closer to figuring out what he was supposed to do next. The moaning mass on the forest floor looked about the furthest thing from a minister of the gospel that he'd ever seen. He dropped to his haunches next to where Jack's face was buried beneath his arms. "I'm here." Another moan. Then Jed heard a muffled, "Oh, God." Jack's fingers clutched at his hair, pulling it into wild tangles. Right. God. The reminder prodded Jed, and he began praying silently. Jack didn't need Kelly or himself. He needed God. "What happened?" he asked after several minutes of prayer. Jack responded by pounding the ground repeatedly with a fist clutching Elison's letter. When he finally threw it in Jed's general direction, the paper was a torn, filthy mess. "Just read it." Jack rolled to a seated position and leaned his arms on his raised knees. Dirt streaked his forehead and bits of twig stuck out from his mussed hair. Jed smoothed the paper out, brushing the dirt off of it, and folded it neatly into thirds, then in half. He reached out and slid the letter into Jack's jacket pocket. "What happened?" he repeated. Jack stared into the brambles, and for a minute Jed wondered if he'd heard. Then his face screwed up and disappeared against his arm. "They're dead," he choked out in a sob. Jed waited, but Jack was obviously not going to volunteer more information without being asked for it, so Jed did. "Who?" "Emma and my child." "How?" There was a pause, then Jack said in a muffled whisper, "They killed them." Jed's eyebrows furrowed. "The Yankees?" Jack gave a low snort. "The doctor." Jed studied the back of Jack's head, trying to sort it out. "The letter explains it all." You really don't want to talk about it? I don't want to have to explain it, Jack corrected. His face lifted, but he turned it away from Jed. It's ghastly, and I don't want to say the words. Can't you just read it? Jed hesitated, his eyes returning to the paper sticking out of Jack's pocket. I can try, but it's a lot of little words and a licensed penmanship. There was a reason why Jack had been the one to go on to further education. Reading came easier to Jack. The paper was filled on both sides with tiny letters, and Alison had one of the worst hands Jed had ever seen from a woman. By the way Jack's shoulders shuddered, it looked like he was crying. Fist pressed to his forehead, he made no movement to return the letter to Jed. Not knowing what else to do, Jed prayed again until Jack spoke through tears. I killed them. He sucked in a noisy breath like he was trying to stop enough to talk more, so Jed handed him a handkerchief in hopes that it would bring blessed quiet. Jack lifted his head and took it, then spent a couple of minutes cleaning himself up. When he finished, he really was a sight, between the swollen face and untamed hair. It was really my fault. None of it would have happened if I hadn't touched her, or if I'd owned up to my responsibility afterwards. How did Alison find out? Jed settled into a seated position off to the side, where Jack wouldn't have to look him in the eye. She said Cecily told her. I don't know who that is. She was my friend. You know, the one whose father almost killed me. She's friends with Alison now, and when I talked to Alison, she said she'd see what Cecily knows about the others. Hopeless confusion slipped over Jed, and he carefully ordered the facts that he knew about Jack's past in his head. Jack had been barely beyond childhood when he made friends with a girl who sneaked the homeless orphan into her room for shelter on cold winter nights. From what Jed understood, that had resulted in Jack's friendship with her going beyond childish things. After her father discovered Jack and threw him out with more than one broken rib, Jack's buddies on the street had basically conducted his recovery with a steady stream of stolen whiskey. That had been the beginning of Jack's drinking problem. What happened next seemed murky to Jed, but he knew Jack had somehow found ways to fund his alcoholism with work he did in the boudoirs of wealthy females. From what Jed understood, joining the Confederate Army was Jack's attempt at leaving that life, but he hadn't truly found freedom from it until he found Christ at Reverend Dinsmore's church in Chicago. The Reverend's third daughter, Alison, moved to Raleigh after marrying Jack's friend, and apparently was now feeding Jack information from the girl who started it all. Jed was beginning to feel thankful for the decades he had spent avoiding women and the kind of mess that came with them. He exhaled and scrubbed his hand down his face. So, what did Cecily say about Emma? Yeah, Emma. Do you remember her? Jack turned his head, sending Jed a dark look. Yes, I remember her. Somewhat. Jed shrugged in response. All the how and why is in the letter, but Alison said Cecily overheard a conversation, and she remembers it because it was so shocking to her at the time, and she was young. She'd never heard anything like it before, and she listened because they were talking about me. She thinks it was a cousin that Emma was talking to, but Emma was telling this person that she was scared that her father was going to put her into an asylum. An asylum? Yes, for interruption of menses. They get put in an asylum for that? Jack shook his head. I don't know. Apparently. I'm just telling you what Alison said Cecily told her. I see. Emma said that her mother convinced her father to send her, Emma, to the female doctor instead, to restore it. Jack stopped meaningfully, and Jed slowly translated the words in his head. But it was interrupted because there was a child. Jack picked up a leaf and began tearing it into pieces. Alison, or rather Cecily, used the word quickening. But they mean a child. Quickening means you're far enough along to feel it. Right? Jed dipped his head, watching the pieces of leaf Jack tore fall to the ground. So, to restore the menses means to eliminate the child. Silence fell while Jack plied the handkerchief against his face for a length of time. And Cecily and you are sure it was yours? It was mine, Jack choked through a sob. It would have been the right time, and besides, Cecily said Emma used my name. The breath left Jed's chest. No wonder Jack howled when he read the letter. You said the child and Emma? Jack nodded. She didn't make it. She said she was going to the doctor on Thursday, and her obituary was in the paper on Sunday. Something went wrong. Or she could have died from 100 other causes, Jed reminded him. Cecily's father was working on a project for Emma's. Mr. Emerson, Cecily's father, told her mother over breakfast that the project was paused because the man's daughter died the day before in surgery. It doesn't sound like Cecily was stretching anything by assuming that the lives of both Emma and my child were taken because of my actions. If I had been present, the situation would have been different, Jack finished, rubbing the heels of his dirty hands against his eyes. You think so? You were an orphan. I can't imagine a family of means consulting your opinion, even if you were the father. They could have made me marry her. I sincerely doubt that they would have wanted that, especially considering your age, Jed said, but Jack had a point. None of it would have happened if it weren't for Jack's intrusion into Emma's life. Elyson said, Jack began, then roughly cleared his throat. She said in North Carolina that if a woman is found to be expanding out of wedlock, she has to go to the court and take out a bastardy bond. She can either name the father, who is then dragged into court and forced to financially support his child, or not name him and pay a fine. It's a guarantee to make sure the child doesn't become the county's problem, like I was. Jack took a quivery breath. When Elyson gets an opportunity, she's planning to go to the courthouse and look through the bonds for me. I don't think anyone named me, or I would have heard about it, unless they couldn't find me. That's the only other thing she could think of. The only other possibilities are if someone sent a child to the orphanage out of state, or a married relative took an illegitimate child as their own. The brothers sat quietly for another minute. Then Jack swore and threw the handkerchief on the ground. I hate this whole thing. His voice cracked. I hate every single part of my life in that state. How young I was, and that Emma died. Jack lifted his chin and looked Jed in the eye. You know I've always had a hard time with it, with the memories and the guilt and the appetites and the whole thing. Even after I got saved, it's been a massive battle to get out of the chains of it all. But until this point, I was only dealing with the fact that I was a fornicator and a liar and a thief, see? I hurt people. But now, to have the blood of 2 human beings on my hands? Jack's red eyes filled yet again. Now I know I'm responsible for deaths, not only of a beautiful young woman, but my child as well. And I can't... His words became so garbled that Jed could barely understand them. I can't bear it. You don't have to bear it. Jed would say those words to Jack when he was ready to hear them, but his sobbing brother didn't look in a position to listen just now. I'm sorry, Jack, Jed said instead, and his heart ached. He wondered what Kelly would have said if she'd been the one present when the letter arrived. Chances were she would have buried her face in his chest and sobbed with him, but that wasn't Jed's mode of operation. I know you think I overreact. I don't think you're overreacting now. I'd be on the ground too if I got a letter like that one. Jed inhaled and looked around. It's getting dark, though, so we should probably get out of the woods. Oh, right. Jack scrambled to his feet. Aunt Mary's waiting with supper. Jed picked up his hat and brushed it off, remembering for the first time his chores that had been interrupted. Daniel would have helped Jed's assistant, Theo, finish them by now. I'm just going to go grab something in the dining hall and go to bed. Give the girls my apologies. Jed gave a short nod, leading the way out to the clearing. Yeah, get some rest. He started up the road in the direction of his cabin, but stopped. Jack? Jack turned around and Jed waved an arm back at him. You're going to want to clean up a bit before you go into the dining hall. Thank you for joining me today.